My name is Stevie Ruiz, and I'm from the Department of Chicano and Chicano Studies at Cal State Northridge. First, I want to thank the organizers for putting together a really great series of speakers, but also to Janella for your talk. It was really good. So I hope I can contribute to the conversation in a productive way. So this paper is out of my book manuscript that I'm currently working on, and the title of the book is Empire Under the Sun, but this is actually one chapter, and the larger project looks at environmental history at the US-Mexico border between the California-Arizona borderlands. And I start off with a map, or the two flags of the Japanese Empire, because of the accusations of espionage that were accused of against Japanese American citizens. And this is actually the Colorado River Indian tribe's flag. So it's kind of ironic that they both symbolize this kind of rising sun in the desert. So I'll go ahead and begin. In the wake of Executive Order 9066, citizens of Japanese descent were forcibly evacuated in desert communities throughout the nation, including the removal to Native American reservations. En masse, citizens were transported to war relocation centers that included states such as California, Oregon, Arkansas, Arizona, and Washington. And located in Poston, Arizona, the Colorado River Indian Reservation was to become one of the two largest internment camps during World War II. Its sister camp was located at the Gila River Indian Reservation in southern Arizona, which was to become the second. And 90% of Japanese Americans who were relocated from the Imperial Valley. This is actually a map. Kind of can see, like the bottom periphery actually shares with Arizona and California's border, the Colorado. But one of the most interesting things is that 90% of folks who were taken from the Imperial Valley in Southern California, which is actually along the US-Mexico border, were sent to Colorado River and Gila River relocation centers. And in terms of its built environment, each was made up of large barracks that were newly constructed by Native American contractors, which was one of the contingencies of placing Japanese Americans on these Indian reservations. Now, the camp's construction, however, did not go uncontested. The Poston Relocation Center is significant because the Indian Council, which consisted of tribes belonging to the Mojave, the Chemehuevi, the Hopi, and the Navajo, denied U.S. Department of the Interior's initial request to use American Indian lands in 1942. Internment was justified by accusations that Japanese Americans were spies who intended to subvert U.S. security on behalf of the Japanese Empire. And on the basis that internment was racially discriminatory, Indian elders viewed Japanese American war relocation as a similar practice to American Indian land removal. And despite tribal disapproval, in 1943, the U.S. War Relocation Authority transferred nearly 17,000 internees from Southern California to the Poston camp. Now, at the Colorado River Relocation Center, Japanese Americans of varying ages, young people, including elementary level school children, backgrounds, and national status, converge upon the desert lands that belong to Native American nations. So, a key dimension of this project thus far has been to elucidate the tensions and conflicts that arise about uneven power relations between the U.S. nation-state and federal Indian Land Authority, as well as citizens. And such power relations were structured by access to racial capital, as I argue, particularly within the context of the Imperial Valley. So one of the things I'm interested in is what happens to Japanese American lands as they are interned in the interim in the Imperial Valley, and then what happens to the lands of Native Americans in the interim in terms of the ecological impact that it has and weighs upon Native American populations. So this is kind of can give you a kind of sense of some of the issues that the Chemehuevi, the Hopi, the Navajo, and this Colorado Indian tribe has been dealing with. For one, is that the Colorado River historically has been a place of contention and conflict between the U.S. government, the Mexican nation state, as well, because of privatization through the All-American Canal located at the U.S.-Mexico border. And this canal acts as a border, and it has been labeled the most dangerous body of water in North America because so many Mexican immigrants die in this body of water every year. But another significant component of it is in the Arizona part of where the Colorado River runs, is that the Colorado River Indian tribe has thrived for many centuries, and they have created a sense of home around this place. And they are continuing in this continuous conflict now over water and privatization on the part of the US government. So you can actually see that the issue of water in this area impacts a varying amount of groups, right? And one of the things that I'm most interested in is how you can take an issue-based politics such as water, land, and show how it means so many different things to so many different communities, right? All in one place. So I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about the case study and what I found during the internment of Japanese Americans and on American Indian land. So land sovereignty has held several competing definitions among Native American scholars. Native Hawaiian scholar J. Kehaulani Kalanui, for example, has argued for a more expansive view of self-determination that contests discourses of authenticity and blood quantum. To expand upon her definition, sovereignty is the power of to self-determine the political economy and the political authority over land belonging to Native populations. And in the context of the Colorado River Relocation Center, the Indian Council's power was overrun by the decisions made by the War Relocation Authority to relocate Japanese Americans onto Native American lands. Now, under federal authority or federal law, American Indian reservations were protectorates or considered protectorates of the United States, and therefore during wartime could be used for the war effort. Now, when taking into consideration the history of land dispossession, Native Americans have denied self-determination were denied self-determination due to their lack of access to racial capital. So I'm actually arguing that there's a huge significance to land, citizenship, and racial capitalism. Now, under the Indian Removal Act of 1831, for example, Native Americans were forcibly removed from the Great Plains regions with families and children under the Indian Appropriations Act of 1851, effectively created the reservation system with the contingency that Native Americans devote loyalty to the United States, right? So this is another law. Under the Dawes Act of 1887, Native Americans' decision-making power was further centralized when their property was auctioned off to white settlers moving to the rural West through homesteading laws. Now, such laws were used to generate dependency and loyalty among Native Americans, particularly when land rights were involved. Now, in the context of the Colorado River Relocation Center, Native Americans held no means to possess property rights, and thus they were not afforded racial capital in the ways white settlers were. When a Chemehuevi Indian Native American woman named Ruby Snyder was interviewed in 1942 concerning the relocation of Japanese American evacuees to Poston, she welcomed photographer Clem Albers onto her land. This is actually a photograph of her. And you can actually see her dwelling water out of the dwell from the ground. So this is actually a main source of how to access water is underground. So Clem Albers is actually a representative, and he argues that Albers was a photographer working on behalf of the Office of War Relocation. So they actually sent out photographers to talk to Native Americans about how they felt about Japanese internment, and contacted the Department of the Interior. And he visited Native American families who lived on the Colorado River Indian Reservation. As he approached her ranch in Parker, Arizona, Snyder was busy pumping water from an underground water unit. Now, she was a middle-aged woman who was reluctant to have her photograph taken, but still engaged with Albers. And in fact, in photographs taken of her, she stares off into the distance, turning away from Albers as if suspicious of his intentions with her image. According to cultural geographer Gillian Rose, to take a photograph of a person during this time, standing upright in the center of a photograph, allotted for the image, it stands as a powerful representation of that person. And in terms of the power of this image, Snyder stands as a dominant character, where she looks at the landscape and topography around her under her own terms. Right? So we can actually think about the fact that despite that she didn't have agency over how she was represented, nonetheless she was able to stand upright, do something to make it and define the image under her own terms. Now, such a powerful imagery contradicted the state of relations between the U.S. nation-state and the concurrent disagreement between the Indian Council had with the government concerning the creation of the relocation camp. When asked about incoming internees, Snyder said she knew little information except the Japanese were outstanding farmers. And as she pumped water into her bucket, Snyder mentioned, "I hear the Japanese are wonderful farmers. I would like to go down to see how they grow things." And interestingly, she viewed evacuees as potential instructors that could better assist in the cultivation of land that she was native to. That's the ironic thing. And in the past decade, the Colorado River Indian Reservation endured a number of droughts that season that made cultivation difficult. Such an ecological crisis may have piqued Snyder's interest in the desert-based agriculture that many Japanese Americans were thriving in the Imperial Valley. So they were used to working in desert landscapes and transforming the ecology through irrigation practices running from the Colorado River. So that potentially this could actually benefit them in some way. Snyder's remarks demonstrated that there were concerns about the shortage of water in the region and the potential loss for desert farmers. Beyond her knowledge about Japanese cultivation practices, Snyder knew nothing about the humiliation that internment caused for many Japanese Americans. Actually, when she was asked about this, she actually said that she really didn't know too much. Ironically, the construction of the Colorado River Relocation Center was built with the assistance of Native American contractors. This is actually one of the Mojave men, or two men working in the beds, and this actually was a contingency of allowing Japanese Americans onto Native American lands. So ironically, the construction of the Colorado River War Relocation Center was built with the assistance of Native American contractors who were in dire straits for financial relief. Right? So we shall actually frame this within the context of the fact that there's drought season and a reoccurring impact and dependency that is waged upon the Colorado River Indian tribes. So many Native Americans, including the Hopi and the Apache, were living in poverty-stricken circumstances, and the construction of barracks for war relocation provided them temporary job growth. Right? In a study conducted in 1942 that was based upon generating Native American support of the United States during wartime, political scientist John Collier surveyed the participation of Native American tribes in assisting the wartime effort. Because war relocation was viewed as a dimension of the wartime security machine, he classified this as support for the war. So Collier is taking the circumstances of poverty and a means of survival and saying, well, because Native Americans are building the barracks, then they also obviously support the war effort and the U.S. nation state. Right? So this is the logic of these political scientists that are going out there. So even though this was a means to produce capital in order to curb long-term poverty on reservations, when writing about Native American participation, he wrote, almost overnight, 1,200 Indians found hundreds of trucks pouring over their roads to unload building material. Barracks began to rise on the unoccupied land adjacent to homes. Collier was dismissive of the fact that Native Americans required a resolution to recurrent desert droughts and poverty that was instrumental to malnourishment of their children. And based upon Collier's description, he assumes that Native Americans held the capital to deny. Remind you, capitalism gives you a choice to say, I don't want help, right? To deny certain forms of labor based on their ethical position. This idea that you choose what you want, right? Where you participate in what you need, what your needs to fulfill your needs. Whereas in prior circumstances, racial capitalism has come in the form of land ownership. In this case, Native Americans couldn't afford to decline labor, right? It's not in their vested interest. Now I'll give you another photograph that I thought was interesting in my research. So when the relocation center actually closes, okay, great, perfect. In 1945, Hiraku Iwasaki, who was actually interned but was able to return to the camp, was preparing to leave the Colorado River Indian Reservation, and then referring to this photograph right here. So this is actually a former internee returning to the camp. And upon his exit, Iwasaki comes across a group of Hopi women and children waiting outside vacant barracks. So he's remember, these are the barracks that our internees were using. And he's returning, and he's a photographer. And after speaking with a white elderly woman who accompanied the Hopi, he learned that the barracks were to stay in place. So the barracks that were used for internees were to stay there. They weren't going to demolish them. And in fact, Mrs. A.D. Franchville, who's the white woman at the center left, who was the superintendent of home economics at Poston, said these barracks would make nice quarters for the Hopi. Right? Prisons make good places for the Native Americans to live. To Iwasaki's astonishment, the physical places that haunted his internment were to become someone else's home. A keepsake. He took a photograph of the group of women and their children as they stood next to Mrs. Franchville. Before exiting, he wrote in his notes about the irony that the barracks that confined his family for so many years could potentially provide relief to others. He himself says, well, I mean, even though this had devastating consequences upon my family, I was willing, I can also see the benefits of this. As I'm continuing on, I just want to kind of give you some of the logic of progressives during this moment. There were white liberal or leftist groups, and that included Dorothea Lange. And Dorothea Lange actually was one of the few wartime photographers to go out into the field, and this is actually a photograph of Lange taking a photograph of a Japanese American child with a kind of ethnically ambiguous child in 1942. This is 3 days prior to internment beginning. And this actually shows that the sentiment of the American public wasn't knowledgeable or couldn't actually understand the gravity of what internment meant, right? And also the intimate knowledge in everyday life that was coerced, estrangement that was forced upon people. And forced internment also meant that this required an entire rethinking of how to treat human beings at a very young age. Right? I'm talking about young little kids being incarcerated. Right? I'm going to also continue just by saying that there were many ways in which Poston as a camp was spun as a positive place, and also viewed or seen as potentially demonstrating that that this is actually a photograph of Florence Maury, who was an evacuee, and she's at this is a CBS news broadcaster who visits the camp, and he uses this as a way of saying, well, even though the camp is interning these people, it still has positive outcomes, right? And he's broadcasting this outside from Poston. One of the kind of things that I read and as I've been doing research on this is I've been able also to access the children's school books. And I was able to find that children, by their own incarceration, started to understand their own position in racialization for the first time. And that was actually something that their parents had kind of forgotten or actually tried to deny as well, because they were trying to assimilate into American standards of American citizenship. And so what this also demonstrates is that what political possibilities that were generated is actually from a young person who writes that through his internment, he begins to understand and identify with Native Americans, Black people, Jews, Chinese, Filipinos, and come into consciousness about who he is and where his position is on the racial hierarchy and where they are in relationship to him. And I'll end with this drawing from one of the school children. Is Yoshio Kamiya. Kamiya And this is actually one of his school books, Future of Clothes. And ironically, he draws the zoot suit, which is predominantly worn by African American and Latino youth during this time. So just kind of give you a sense that this was also a moment of possibility for racial consciousness, or to come into consciousness about race politically. Thank you.